Hello and welcome, my fellow toadies, to another face-bashing and controller-smashing episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that rams its fists deep into the video game franchises that defined our childhoods to then pull out the stories behind their sometimes shaky development histories. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, much like my Double Dragon episode from a while back, oftentimes there's not just one particular reason as to why a specific franchise just fades away. Sometimes the ownership of said IP changes to many hands. Sometimes the original creators move on or retire altogether, and sometimes trends and tastes just change, leaving certain franchises in the dust. And in regards to our subject today, well, it pretty much comes down to all of those reasons and more. Now, if you are a regular viewer of my humble show, over the years you would know that I've covered many works from the legendary studio Rare, but unlike many of their late 90s and early 2000s efforts such as All You See Here, their earliest breakout success was met with a very different fate, one that was both prolonged and, if you were a fan of it, rather painful. However, this fate had more to do with the various publishers of the franchise and the changing of the times, and not so much Rare themselves or even the quality of their work. So, slip on your most studded leather battle gloves and hop aboard your speeder bikes as I answer the question, what happened to Battletoads?
Battletoads.
As some of you may remember, after transitioning from their earliest guise as Ultimate, Play the Game, and developing for the ZX Spectrum, the most British thing you could possibly do, Rare then experienced a period of dizzying highs, terrifying lows, and creamy middles whilst developing for the NES. For every RC Pro Am, there was a Beetlejuice. For every Shake, Rattle, and Roll, there was a Nightmare on Elm Street. And for every Cobra Triangle, there was a Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
I want to nail Roger Rabbit to the fucking cross.
Clearly, Rare's more original efforts were where they shined the most, and in the late 80s and early 90s, they were looking to make another all-original IP, but took a little/a lot of inspiration from the then hottest IP in the world, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Rare's founders, the Stamper Brothers, saw turtle fever firsthand when they visited the United States for a CES show in the early 90s, and noticed the fearsome foursome were absolutely everywhere. Tim Stamper then spoke to artist Kevin Bayliss about coming up with their own characters in that same vein, and since Kevin fancied exploring ponds and rivers in his formative years, that was all it took for them to settle on warty amphibians for their new heroes. In the supplementary material of Rare Replay, Kevin Bayliss also revealed that it wasn't just the TMNT that played a part in inspiring the Toads, but a certain Caped Crusader as well. I remember the Batman film had just hit the movies, and we were looking at all the different merchandising that you could buy for the film and for the character, and we wanted something like that. T-shirts, the plastic models, the bedspreads, everything. And he wasn't kidding. The first Batman film expanded the appeal of The Dark Knight immeasurably with the amount of junk it spawned for kids to buy, something that increased tenfold with Batman Returns, before then peaking with Batman and Robin, which actually damaged that film's script, which you can learn about in this video here. Anyway, let's get off the bats and hop back to Toads. Rare's idea was simple: take what was hot at the time and make it ever so slightly edgier, a little bit more violent, a little bit more titillating, and then take all their know-how from having developed a variety of different genres and mash it all together. This led to Battletoads offering more than your average beat-em-up did at the time. You had platforming sections, secret warps, races, different level-based gimmicks, boss battles, and some dazzling effects that pushed the NES pretty hard when it released in 1991. But as for why the hell this first entry in the series was so friggin' hard, well, that would be because of Mark Betteridge, the original programmer. He was well known within the hallways of Rare of being a hardcore gaming expert, and simply programmed the traps, the platforms, and split-second jumps to a level of difficulty he felt was appropriate for him, which wasn't exactly conducive for mainstream audiences. Now, in terms of publishing, Rare worked for any and all companies, including Milton Bradley, Ultra Games, Nintendo, Laughing Joke and Numbnuts, and for our purposes today, Tradewest. Now, Tradewest has its own weird history. I got into it a little bit in my Double Dragon video, but suffice it to say, they weren't exactly a well-oiled machine, and they viewed Battletoads like it really was going to be the next TMNT, ordering a production of a cartoon pilot, potential comic books and toy lines, just anything they thought could print money and lead to instant gratification.
Works every time!
But sometimes, in fact oftentimes, you can't just get said gratification, instantly. You have to slowly cultivate a franchise and build it up. So, after a flurry of ports to other formats, with almost none of them having any oversight from the team behind the NES original, Rare was then put to work on a 16-bit sequel, which they were happy enough to do, but were then also saddled with developing another game on top of that. One where the Toads would need to share the limelight with another iconic video game series, which, while a good idea on paper, marked the start of the Toads' very sharp decline into the black swirling hole of video game irrelevancy. When it bashed onto the NES in 1991, Battletoads arrived with a lot of hype. In fact, Rash Pimple Ensitz had the distinction of starring in one of the earliest examples of perhaps overhyping in the video game industry. Nintendo Power, the authority in game coverage at the time, were pushing Battletoads more than your average third-party game, bestowing it with 7 awards, or Nesters, in their year-end special, including NES Game of the Year, which, whether you agree or disagreed with, really put Rare on the map after years of middling licensed fare. Despite the enthusiastic critical response, a lot of the tertiary stuff Rare and Tradewest had hoped to profit on, the Battletoads TV show, the underwear, the comic books, well, none of that really came to fruition. The cartoon pilot wasn't picked up by anyone, so that was money flushed right down the toilet. And really, by 1993, Turtle Mania also had started to die down, with sales declining for its various toy lines, along with the third film giving the Turtles' reputation a good old shell kicking.
Okay, Turtles, let's move out!
So merchandising companies weren't really willing to spend money on something that looked, to the layman anyway, like the exact same thing. Because of this, Tradewest decided to break open the emergency glass for something that is usually reserved when a franchise had long since been dormant and in desperate need of a hit: the crossover. Because they were also the Western publisher for Double Dragon at the time, it was a relatively simple matter for Tradewest to secure the rights for Billy and Jimmy Lee once again, and then set Rare to work on forming the Ultimate Team. Now, this is a bit of an educated guess on my part, but some staff at Rare probably all weren't super enthusiastic about developing this game for 2 reasons. One, they were already developing Battle Maniacs for the SNES at the very same time, and 2, they received no support from Technos and how to implement Double Dragon mechanics, characters, and lore into the game. So that's why there were some very obvious errors with that side of the team. Bosses were mixed up with the wrong names, as well as Rare having to come up with their own version of a Double Dragon main villain, the Shadow Boss, who was also a weird mix of several other Technos baddies. Regardless of if this situation was out of Rare's hands or not, certain Lee Brother enthusiasts probably weren't all that happy with the end result. More importantly though, both Battle Maniacs and the Ultimate Team failed to light sales charts on fire, as the Double Dragon franchise had already been seen as a bit long in the tooth by that time, and on top of that, the actual popularity of beat-em-ups or beat-em-up adjacent games was shrinking in the wake of Street Fighter II and its many clones and competitors. So, despite the best efforts of both Rare and Tradewest, the Toads were already looking like something that was on the way out, as both its main aesthetic inspiration and the game genre it was firmly based in was already giving way to other, hotter trends. But this fact was merely the first hit of a 1-2 combo that knocked the Battletoads out of commission for decades, because the final blow came with Battletoads Arcade, the most bombastic and edgy entry in the entire series, but also the least successful. Coming out in 1994, the same year Tradewest was bought by Williams/Midway, this arcade release was funded and distributed by Electronic Arts of all people, which was odd in and of itself because they weren't really involved in the arcade sector much, if at all. This was essentially another sequel, but doubled down on the brawling combat gameplay, and removed many of the platforming elements the series was known for, although it still retained the odd vehicular sequence. Battletoads Arcade was also the first game Rare worked on that used 3D rendered sprites and backgrounds, beating Donkey Kong Country or KI to the punch by a few months. And since it was no longer shackled by Nintendo's then strict guidelines regarding violence, Rare saw fit to add plenty of blood and allowing the Toads' extremities to transform into even deadlier weapons. But in another case of bad timing, coming out in 1994 meant that they were at the peak of the fighting game genre's boom period, and so the Battletoads coin-op underperformed in pretty much every arcade it was placed in, posting profits so low it made Rare really nervous about their forthcoming Killer Instinct, worries that were fortunately unfounded. However, the coin-op's commercial failure was still rough on the team, as they worked really hard on this particular iteration of the Toads, as they were mostly developing/flying by the seat of their pants. Tim Stamper had to design the arcade board himself, which required a lot of trial and error, and even more so for programmer Chris Sutherland, as everything had to be made new from scratch, as it shared no code with the earlier console versions. So, all that work being put into a really fun game that pushed sprite work to its absolute limit, not reaching its intended audience, must have been a bitter pill to swallow. But hey, if bitter is a taste you just can't get enough of, then you'd be interested to know that Rare also produced a fully complete Game Boy title simply called Super Battletoads that they opted to just never release. We did a couple of more Battletoad games for the Game Boy that had crossover similarities with other console versions produced later on, but the fourth Battletoads game you haven't seen. It hasn't come out yet. It was heavily rendered and it looked wonderful, and was a spin-off from the coin-op arcade game. It seems that a combination of the underperformance of the last few Toad titles, along with the fact that Rare felt that third-party Game Boy cart sales were getting fairly soft, is what led to this version's untimely end, and even to this day, Super Battletoads has never been dumped. That might be because, along with KI2 for the SNES, it is still trapped in Tim Stamper's backyard shed, and he refuses to let them out. Thankfully though, neither Tradewest nor Electronic Arts retained any part of the Battletoads IP, so it passed back to Rare, which is obviously the optimal outcome. But because the writing was clearly on the wall by late 1994 and they were already working full-time with Nintendo on a variety of much fresher ideas and characters, the Toads slinked back into their fetid swamp and into deep hibernation. But when they would eventually re-emerge almost 20 years later, it wouldn't be in the way most fans were hoping for. Over the next 2 decades, Rare got so busy juggling barrels, balloons, bears, killer combos, jiggies, jinjos, tribals, and all colors of bananas, that their tough-ass Toads very much fell to the wayside, but there was always the desire to bring them back in some form or fashion. Unfortunately, once Rare was purchased by Microsoft, they had a very, very tough time getting any projects greenlit under their new leadership. Whether it was sequels to Perfect Dark, Killer Instinct, Cameo, or all new ideas and characters, the Xbox 360's march into the dark, poorly controlling world of the Kinect essentially doomed the studio for several years. And once it was made clear that the then Microsoft Fat Cats didn't really envision anything for Rare other than motion-controlled minigames, many of its original staff members slowly moved on to find greener pastures. However, things started to shift somewhat in 2014, where several new projects and initiatives involving Rare and Rare properties were starting to get announced, and the Battletoads, of all things, were at the center of it. Rare Replay, which I've mentioned on this channel many times before, was released for the Xbox One, and was a lovingly crafted homage to the studio's entire history, well, minus the massive Nintendo chunk of course, and contained several of their early and all-time classics, including the NES original Battletoads, along with a never-before officially ported version of the arcade Quarter Muncher, which was for many fans their first time playing it. Damn, I tell ya, there's nothing quite like the feeling of drilling a gaping hole into a slobbering man-pig thing's chest. I suppose because Rare still had a deep-rooted love for the Toads, Rash, Pimple, and Zitz were chosen to be sort of Rare ambassadors around this time, which was lucky because they could have easily gone with Orchid, Spinal, Mumbo Jumbo, Conker, or Mr. Pants. So the Toads found themselves making appearances in a few games over the next year or two, first starting with being special boss characters in the Xbox One version of Shovel Knight, then Rash becoming a playable fighter in the third season of Killer Instinct, where he is still wrecking shop to this very day. And while many felt this indicated that a new Battletoads game was on its way, that was still quite a long way off, and when it was finally revealed, it wasn't exactly well received by the old school battle maniacs out there. Developed by a young British startup, Diala Studios, the simply titled Battletoads took a tongue-in-cheek approach to the source material, portraying the Toads as over-the-hill and struggling for relevancy, with their 90s prime having long since come and gone. While it was unique to implement this fourth-wall breaking style of humor, along with offering some sound beat-em-up mechanics and a variety of minigames to break up the combat-heavy sections, many fans did not care for the new art style, character designs, or how the Battletoads universe was now being portrayed, and when there's been decades of silence between releases, that's kind of understandable. It was also very at odds with how Microsoft had been framing the Toads just a few years prior with their guest appearances, as their cameo battle in Shovel Knight acted like zero time had passed since the 90s, while Killer Instinct gave Rash a very macho, edgy HD makeover, which again might have trained some fans to expect something similar in a future sequel or reboot game.
These cameos are killing me.
You could easily see a shiny, violent, Devil May Cry-like action game that had all three Toads slicing up swaths of bad guys, or a very old-school Mega Man 9-like homage game to the NES original that retained its brutal difficulty. But for whatever reason, I guess to play against expectations, Microsoft and Diala delivered something else entirely, but unfortunately, that risky gamble wound up earning it a lot of mixed reviews.
Woohoo! Battletoads reboot!
Commercially, though, Microsoft did announce that Battletoads 2020 had reached over 1 million players. Reached. A metric which was thrown out often as this was at the height of Game Pass glazing, so it didn't mean all that much in terms of actually generating a profit. That, however, was 6 years ago, and there hasn't been a croak from the Toads since, and there likely won't ever be again. Rare hasn't delivered a new game since 2018's Sea of Thieves, what with the unceremonious cancellation of Everwild, and hell, there hasn't even been any new usage of classic Rare IPs since Banjo and Smash, which in and of itself was 7 years ago, so yeah, things aren't exactly trending upwards for the studio. To at least end on a somewhat positive note, while the Toads' popularity was brief, lasting from 1991 to 1994, it is still one of Rare's most important IPs, something that Kevin Bayliss posited on in an interview with Retro Gamer magazine. Battletoads became a template in some way. Perhaps Battletoads, when you think about it, was a changing point for Rare, and a lot of the game's elements echo throughout many of the company's later titles. Eventually, it became kind of a trademark, I guess, and future Rare games were often varied in the same kind of way as Battletoads. It looked great, sounded and played fantastic, and it set the path for more Battletoads games, which proved its success. It's definitely one I'm proud of being part of. So, while our 3 Acne-based amphibians won't be seeing another comeback anytime soon, it is nice that the staff that worked on the original game still have fond memories of them, with their legacy of being a part of an already legendary studio having already been totally cemented.
Toads rule!